disaster, how this thing is evolving, how we see in terms of its levels with civil society. There is a striking resemblance to what you had shared some 7-8 months back. So we are all eager to hear your thoughts as the keynote speaker, Dr. Gagan.
I thank every one of you for giving me this opportunity. Shyamji, thank you so much. And it's such a apt topic, diaspora, disaster, and development. And I'm also aware of the human service which Sewa and the team have been doing, and of course the European presentation also presents it. So let me start by saying a few things which are there. I'll use a mix of Hindi and English also once in a while. सबसे पहले मैंने अगर disaster की बात करते हैं, you see how are, let's say, organizations managed, corporates or the private world. Typically they are managed if there are no disasters. Typically they are managed based on thumb rule of efficiency. Efficiency means output should be more than divided to input. Simply, it's like गाड़ी का mileage क्या है. We don't consider the safety of the vehicle also, and that is how, let's say, countries' decisions are taken. If you see, many families are wired like that. Most of the time, corporate is also wired like that, and to a fair extent, even the district collector also in the government is wired like that, because he said you reach the masses. So for him, it's like cost of delivery, he'll see and deliver. So efficiency is one criteria. What happens when let's say crisis strikes? It moves towards effectiveness. Effectiveness is essentially what is the goal and how do we meet things. And what happens when disasters strike or when disasters happen frequently, like what was mentioned in Odisha, Kerala, etc., where the disaster response ability especially is far superior, and there is you can say a lessons that they seem to have learned and they have imparted. So there you see that it is moving from efficiency to effectiveness to what I call as anthropocentric sustainability. That is where human beings are being taken care of and disaster to human beings is being mitigated. If we stretch this a little bit further, if disasters kaise kam ho, it possibly has to move from efficiency to effectiveness, effectiveness to anthropocentric sustainability, and from anthropocentric sustainability to all systems sustainability, which is where the climate cooperation and community kind of that aspect comes in play. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is, disaster mitigation to be done well is about anthropocentric sustainability, which is what most of the UN and other, you could say, World Health Organization, etc., are fairly centric about. But we move a little further, it is essentially all system sustainability, and possibly the next stage is on those lines. Number one. Number two, if we observe the response for COVID from different countries, अगर आप देखेंगे different countries का response COVID के लिए, let's say for Hong Kong, for China, city-state, that is what I call a small city-state economies like Hong Kong, Singapore, or China, or let's say USA or India, you will observe that there is a difference that has been there in their response to disaster versus our response to disaster. In their response to disaster versus our response to disaster. Now what happens is, there are 5 values based on which policy decisions are taken. Typically, the literature says there are 5 values based on which decisions are taken, and depending on what is more priority. What are those 5 goals or 5 goals which are there? One is, let's say, what we call as equity perspective. equity is uniformity in distribution. Another is efficiency perspective. Third is welfare perspective, wherein you take care of the needs of the people. Fourth is liberty perspective. And fifth is what we call as the security perspective. If you observe USA's response for COVID, it was largely driven by liberty perspective. उस देश का वायरिंग उसी तरह से है और इसीलिए लगभग आधा यूएस में जो है मेरे ख्याल में कोविड नॉर्म्स और मास्क वगैरह भी नहीं था. And forget about taking vaccination. And if you observe the response of, let's say, a state like China, it was driven by what I will call as, let's say, efficiency perspective. Since they did not want the economy to be hurt, etc. So the point is, relatively speaking, these were, in hindsight, one can say that they were more myopic in their decision making. If we observe the response of some of these city-state economies like Hong Kong or Singapore, it was probably more driven by what we call as, you can say, security perspective combined with efficiency. The summary is, as a nation, we as a country did extremely well, and of course civil societies in India definitely contributed a lot, because in this country it was largely speaking, the decision making was driven by welfare and equity perspective. So our response to COVID was far, far superior to the other countries. So what I'm trying to say is, in terms of the policy trade-offs of these 5 goals that are there, I think one more lesson which we can draw is possibly to see where is the welfare and equity perspective being built into disaster. So that's something compared to, let's say, efficiency or liberty. मुझे बाहर क्यों नहीं जाने दे रहे हैं, बस वहाँ पे रोक दिया गया है, तो someone will say that. So those implicit aspects like which some of the illustrations, live illustrations were mentioned, I think can be captured. That was the second, you can say, part that is there. I agree, disaster has a very contagious effect. In other words, the reverse will be civil society's job of making it a very kind of doable or positive effect is something which I think that is the other side, the positive side of the contagious effect, I think is a huge takeaway. And in that sense, this is something which I would say has not been valorized. Not been valorized means लोग बोलते नहीं हैं. But the fact is that role of the civil society comes in that particular positive structuring of the whole disaster situation that is there. And of course, there are a few other things which are there, and one of the things which was very nicely mentioned by the panelists out there was essentially the role of higher education institutions is missing. It's a very valid point. Why will a student in an MBA program or any other program learn about disaster management? You say, "Yaar, itna boring subject hai, kahan se main jaake padunga?" And the point is, however, it is very important for a modern generation, which is possibly from a nuclear family with hardly 1 to 2 siblings in their family, or typically they have none in fact these days. I think to also understand what we call as managing failure. So in that sense, perhaps aspects of higher education institutes, possibly in undergrad, year 1, they need to have certain way to capture disaster management or certain response out there. So the point is that's something which is there. There are, of course, higher education institutions contribution could be in multiple ways. One is by way of community engagement initiatives, like having workshops, presentations, experience sharing, social cohesion mechanisms, etc. Then higher education institutions could possibly support these things by having a research and scholarship for disaster management. For example, if let me put it this way: as a director of IIM Raipur, I'd be very happy if IIM is part of any kind of disaster management. You can say program or course which can be created or which can be structured, or wherein coursework and other things. Given that India has already taken a lead, why can't we also find ways and means of documenting and possibly having? So that's something wherein which it benefits scholars, policymakers, and also practitioners. Because you see these vivid live experiences which some of my esteemed panel members mentioned need to be captured, and that's something which wherein I think as in higher education institutions can contribute. The other part is I think higher education institutions contribution gets maximized if you make it compulsory as part of undergraduation year one, because it is implicitly going to promote these values of equity, welfare over liberty, security, or efficiency, which I just mentioned as a nation. So these are, I think, some thoughts that I am having. I know all of us are, you can say, patient out there, and I think I would not like to take much time out there. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Kakanichi, for summarizing the whole response to disasters and ideally focusing on the equity as well as the welfare part. Since we are running out of time, I would request our chair of the session, Major General Manoj Bindalji. So you have graciously compiled the whole thing. So we look forward to your final and closing remarks for this discussion.
I will not read out whatever because it's a long list. But something which have come out very clear, loud and clear. One is the coordination with the government agencies. First step towards encouraging civil society.